Hi, folks. I'm Dr. Russ Wallers with Ball State's Department of Marketing and Management. We're broadcasting live from the 12th floor of the business building this evening, and I believe this is being broadcast in living color, so I hope you enjoy this. This video corresponds to weekly module 4, which covers chapter 5 in our text, and I'm going to try to keep this as brief as possible and touch on what I think are some of the main issues. The topic is demographic dimensions of global consumer markets. So we will be addressing demographic trends and how they impact consumers, population growth and shifting patterns, the distribution of income within the U.S., family life cycle, which is a new concept that we'll introduce, and how that affects consumer spending, and also some issues regarding ethnic market segments that I think are relevant to talk about. So the next 3 chapters of our text look at both final consumers and organizational customers. Final consumers buy products and services for their own personal use, and organizational customers buy for firms that in turn make other goods and services. Chapter 5 focuses on demographic dimensions of consumer markets, so we're talking about final customers. Chapter 6 takes issue with buying behavior of final customers, so that we switch from looking in Chapter 5 on demographics to looking at consumer psych or consumer behavior in Chapter 6, again on with respect to final consumers. And then Chapter 7 tackles the buying behavior of organizational customers. So that's our roadmap. The current chapter reading looks at final consumers and some key selected key demographic patterns characterizing consumers both globally and within the U.S. So that's our plan. In general, studying demographics is important for the marketing manager to understand markets. In defining a market, it's important to note that a market has 3 major components. Number 1, people or a population base. If we're talking about industrial marketing, we could be talking about number of firms, but there has to be a population mass. Number 2, we're talking about people, but also people with some buying power. And number 3, unsatisfied needs. With regard to the people component, we're talking about looking at population trends, demographic trends. It's important to understand population trends, and that's a real key issue in marketing. Let me back up. With respect to the money building block of markets, we're talking basically about studying buying power trends. And with respect to the third component, unsatisfied needs, consumer has to be motivated to spend resources in exchange for goods and services. So we're assuming that the motivation for that comes from having unsatisfied needs. All 3 components are important in looking at what a market is and assessing the quality of markets. With respect to these 3 aspects of a market, the third issue, unsatisfied needs and consumers' willingness to spend, that's more a topic that we'll tackle in the next chapter. The other 2 issues, though, relate to our topic in chapter 5, demographics. When assessing the attractiveness of markets, one might ask 3 questions, which are, what are the market's relevant segmentation dimensions? Secondly, how big is the market? And thirdly, where is the market? So all of these issues relate to demographic patterns and studying demographic trends is really an important skill for the marketing manager to develop. Marketers should always be on the lookout for growth markets, and the reason for this should be pretty obvious. One issue is that the U.S. market reflects only about 5% of the world's population, so in effect it's not that huge a market in the broad worldwide global scene. Current population growth rate in the U.S. is not particularly high, it's very low. So in that sense, the U.S. market does not offer much growth which would be linked to population. Other global markets offer a lot higher growth rates and much more desirable population trends. So that, it's an obvious reason to look globally. Here's an interesting graphic. This relates to buying power, but regarding buying power, the marketing manager can use a number of different measures. We're talking here about comparing the relative worth of different markets based on buying power. In international marketing, we often look at gross domestic product and gross national income. This graphic is pretty self-explanatory. Gross national income, when added to the income earned by foreigners who own resources in a particular nation, the sum total of those represent gross domestic product. We often will look at gross domestic product stats in comparing one country versus the other. It might make more sense to look at gross national income in certain cases. And income per capita is really another measure, since neither gross domestic product or gross national income really relate to the income in the hands of individual consumers. We often look at the per capita income as a way to compare buying power from country to country. But it's kind of a situation-specific issue. Those are some of the terms that you often hear the economists talk about and people in marketing research. So as you go through the material, pay attention to those terms. Technology is another issue that impacts the value of various alternative markets. Even cell phones and internet usage saturation levels becomes an issue. We've observed explosive growth in both of these technologies in developing nations abroad. There are a lot of international statistics on this that are quite interesting. In terms of domestic demographics, population is a key market determinant, which is pretty obvious. Here's a map of the U.S. with population levels and growth rates shown. Population is obviously shifting south and west, as shown by the blue states. This is not any news to anyone. And if you look at the Rust Belt states, which are shown here in the light color, many of the Rust Belt states even show negative population growth. Ohio, Pennsylvania, West Virginia, New York, so forth. Michigan especially, too. The issue in studying these trends is to understand where the markets exist. The markets are linked to the size of population bases, so that, in a sense, is an obvious reason for studying these. Some of these growth rates or decrease rates are a little bit misleading. If you look at the graphic, for instance, the projected growth rate in population over the next, between 2000 and 2010 for Nevada is 34.2%. But you have to understand that the base population level in Nevada is a lot smaller than it would be, say, in New York or Florida. But it is a very high growth rate area. So that's the point, just to notice the patterns. In terms of population trends in the U.S., in the consumer market especially, this slide raises several issues. The rate of population in the U.S. has grown over the years, but it has slowed down dramatically. With a very low current birth rate in the U.S., most of the future growth in population is expected to come from immigration, which is rather surprising but true. If you look at the composition of different sectors within the population, age-wise, baby boomers born during the period of 1946 to 1964 are now at the start of their retirement year. This demographic trend is often referred to as the graying of America, and this is a really important market. It's a growing group, percentage-wise, with extremely high buying power, and it's a prime market for many goods and services tapping the needs of these individuals, many of whom are either just entering retirement or have entered retirement. It's a tremendous market for what? Leisure products, health-related products, any retirement issue related product you can think of is offered by that market. Generation X consumers are born between period maybe 1965 to 1977. They're now in their mid-30s, and they have a different set of needs. Generation Y consumers, sometimes referred to as millennials, are those born from 1978 to 1994. Most of our current students are what, millennials. This group grew up with technology and has other attributes that set it apart, as discussed in the text. Buying approach is a lot different than the Gen Xers or the baby boomers. In addition to looking at national income figures, such as gross domestic product or gross national income, marketing managers often look at family or household income statistics as measures of market worth as well. Here's a graphic shown here. Historically, as shown, we've experienced a long tradition of steady growth in household income. The conventional saying is that each successive generation enjoys a much higher standard of living than the one preceding it. If you look at the trend here, it looks sort of linear, but over the last 10 years, it looks like it's sort of starting to become a little curvilinear. So the point of this is just to notice that it's important to monitor trends of this type. Since household income relates to market buying power, this is obviously a really important issue for marketing managers. Here's another way to look at income. Income is a rather broad concept, and we could look at different types of income. This slide is fairly important in that sense. If you look at total, let's focus on household income. The household has total income coming into the household. If you subtract taxes from total income, the remainder is what we call disposable income, and that is income available within the household that the household has to spend on everything other than taxes. So that's total income minus taxes equals disposable income. If you subtract necessities from disposable income, that leaves what marketers call discretionary income. Necessities would relate to things like housing, food, clothing. It's kind of a fuzzy term in a way, subject to a little interpretation, but I think most families would have a market basket of necessities that are pretty common from household to household. So disposable income less necessities equals discretionary income. And it's important to distinguish between discretionary income and disposable income for a couple reasons. Here's an example. In this slide, this is an ad for a luxury good, obviously. This is a Porsche ad. And I think we'd all agree that the ability to buy this type of good relates more to discretionary income than disposable income. Discretionary income is income that's often used for extras, right? Leisure-related products and luxury goods. So in looking at demographic trends regarding income, distinguishing between disposable and discretionary income is pretty important. There are several trends regarding U.S. households and families that merit looking at. Um, the traditional family, which I think we usually think of as the nuclear family comprised of mom, dad, and a couple kids, uh, that's sort of the traditional family, appears to be disappearing uh, as describing most households in the U.S. today. Things are not quite as they were back in the 50s. And a couple trends that have developed over the last couple decades. Obviously, the high divorce rate is a factor that's fragmented the nuclear family to a large extent. We have a lot of married couples that have decided not to have kids or postpone having children. So these are households consisting of two people, smaller households. And then you have a lot of single adult households, households comprised of one person. So one interesting trend that we're seeing in the U.S. is that while population isn't growing much at all, the number of households is growing at a very high rate uh, because the household size is dropping. And a lot of products are household related. If you think of the demand for trash service, it's not really uh, dictated by the size of the household as much as it is as the number of households. Cable TV service, things of that type. So these are just some trends to take a look at. This next slide is really interesting. This introduces an interesting concept that we call the family life cycle. And the idea is that as consumers go through successive family life cycle stages over time, their market basket need for goods and services changes. So in a sense, these different groupings, these different stages represent, to some extent, different types of consumer markets. If you look at this slide, the right in the center, horizontally going across the screen, there's a set of 7 stages: young singles, young marrieds with children, without children, young marrieds with children, so forth. That that represents what we've often thought of as the traditional family life cycle. And the idea is that as individuals go through those different stages, their needs change. I think you find that people that are young singles have a different market basket than people who are middle-aged married with children, right? As far as the types of products they need to spend their money on. So the idea is for the marketing manager to understand the differences in the needs as consumers go through those life cycle stages. The the other cells shown in this figure recognize the divorce rate and so forth that are variations on the traditional life cycle. But the idea is to notice how the needs within the family change over time. An example might be, let's say you're an appliance manufacturer. Young marrieds with children, without children, and young marrieds with children. Those 2 stages represent a huge market for buyers of appliances, first-time buyers of appliances. When the family gets to the point where they're middle-aged married with children or middle-aged married without children, that's the point where they become candidates for replacement appliances. So companies like Whirlpool will forecast demand separately for first-time buyers and those in the replacement market. And they do use this type of concept. Here are some examples of family life cycle implications that marketing managers probably should recognize. Uh, different different stages of the family life cycle are comprised of people that have different acceptance rates for new ideas. I think that's pretty much common sense. Um, these are some concepts that you should focus on when you go through the text. Empty nesters is an interesting example. We have a lot of consumers in a category we would call the empty nesters. They're households where the children are no longer present. Often these consumers are in a really high income producing stage, or sometimes they're retired, but they have a fairly high wealth base established at that point. So they have a lot of buying power, a lot of time to use on leisure pursuits, and it's a real prime market. So the idea is just to note the different trends from stage to stage. Finally, the text concludes by looking at ethnic subgroups that may represent important sources of new markets within the United States. Most ethnic groups exhibit much higher population growth rates than their non-ethnic counterparts. So in that sense, they offer a fairly high degree of market size growth. Um, Ethnic groups also have increasingly high median incomes. That's a definite demographic trend. And ethnic groups often buy and consume products in behaviorally different and important ways than their non-ethnic counterparts. That depends on the product. If you're talking about products that are related to the culture of specific ethnic groups, that's where you find the variation. Things that are not related to an ethnically relevant cultural spin would really not vary from culture to culture. Things like Kleenex, I don't see where that would be a big issue. But certainly food products, cosmetics, clothing, perhaps. The issue is to just recognize that there may be some ethnic market segmentation opportunities, which are opportunities for marketers to respond in ways that satisfy the needs of these different ethnic groups that may differ and make them segmentable. Couple caveats. One of the things that we really need to avoid when we look at ethnic segmentation is to avoid stereotyping. That's a real danger. For instance, if you look at the Latin American market and say, well, we have a Hispanic market, that's very misleading, because if you break that Hispanic market down into different nationalities within Latin America, you find a lot of cultural differences and a lot of behavioral buying differences. So you have to be very, very careful to show some specificity, I guess we might say, when we look at individual ethnic groups, and really do our homework and understand the differences. I think that pretty well wraps that up. So hopefully this has provided you with an idea on which issues to concentrate when you read this material in the 5th chapter. Again, make sure you review the key words summaries at the end of the chapter, and be careful out there, and we'll see you online. Thanks.